Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, bets are off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me?
All right. Good evening, everyone. Hello, hello. Are we ready for some more Temple and Lodge? I am. It's not the most exciting book. I'm going to admit that. Um, it could be better. What in the heck? Channel management. What is all this shite? Okay, there we go. I don't know what that was. Sorry. Okay. And where are my captions? Where are my captions? Where are my I had to do a reboot earlier. And, yeah. I forgot I needed to reset this because, that's how I roll. I always forget my captions. There we go. That should be working. And if y'all will bear with me, I'm going to change to my gaming screen for a second and go ahead and fix the captions there. Oh, nope, they're working there. Awesome. Awesome, 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 awesome. That's right. I forgot. I have it all linked. Because I'm using OBS now. Unlike the Twitch software, where I had to do it separately. All right. So let's get into this. We're going to do 2 chapters tonight. They're fairly short chapters, so it's like 21 pages total. We're starting into the 3rd section, The Origins of Freemasonry, Chapter 10, The Earliest Freemasons. In its present form, Freemasonry dates specifically from the 17th century. Indeed, it is a unique product of the 17th century thought and circumstances, a synthesis of the multifarious ideas and perceptions brought about by the convulsions in Western religion, philosophy, science, culture, society, and politics. The 17th century was a period of cataclysmic change, and it was as a response to this that Freemasonry crystallized. Freemasonry was to act as a kind of an adhesive, a binding agent which served to hold together in a way that the Catholic Church no longer could, the diverse elements and components of a fragmenting world, a fragmenting worldview. It is to the 17th century that Freemasonry itself generally looks for its own origins, or at any rate, looks for the first emergence of the structure that has filtered down to us today. Thus, Freemasonic writers and historians have delved exhaustively into 17th century affairs, endeavoring to trace the gradually spreading network of lodges, to chart the process whereby certain rites spawned other rites and various illustrious personalities became involved. Of necessity, we have to address ourselves, albeit cursorily, to the same material. It is not the purpose of this book, however, to attempt any such catalogue. We have no wish to overlap what can readily be found in the copious histories of Freemasonry, and what, though relevant enough to Freemasons themselves, is irrelevant to non-brethren. Our purpose must be to attempt some species of overview, to trace the main thrust, the general spirit and energy of Freemasonry as it suffused and eventually, we would argue, transformed English society. Can I up the volume a bit? Not on me. Um, it doesn't. Well, let me look at something here. Ooh. No, that just increases my volume, not the mic's volume. Oh, no. How about that? Is that any better? I don't know. No change? Okay. Um, let's see. Yeah, everything's maxed out here. Um, let's see. Hide read. Let me look at something here. Um, how's that? Is that any better? Still no change. God damn it. I've got the volume set at 200%. There's nothing I know what to do. I can't change anything on the headset itself without changing just the total volume. Uh, yeah, the only volume setting on these is just the earphones, not the mic. So, um, I don't know. I don't know what to do, what else to do with it. I'll have to look into how the hell do I increase the volume, or maybe I'll have to try doing the external mic. Maybe that would be better. You have to max it out to hear me. Oh, shit. Well, unfortunately, there's nothing I can do about it right now. I'll have to just look into it. I don't know why it's so quiet. Let's. Does that change anything? There's one more thing here that I thought I'd try, and maybe just you. All right. Okay, where were we? As we have seen, Freemasonry in the years prior to the English Civil War and Cromwell's Protectorate became closely associated with Rosicrucianism. We have already quoted, page 119, from the poem composed in 1638 by Henry Adamson of Perth. If artistic quality is any gauge, Adamson may well have been a pre-incarnation of William McGonagall, acknowledged master of illiterature. Weirdly enough, Adamson's poem also pertains to the collapse of a bridge over the Tay. It is worth quoting here in fuller detail. So, yeah, there's quite a poem here. So, just by this time we see the bridge of Tay. Oh, happy sight indeed was it that day! A bridge so stately with 11 great arches, joining the south and north, and common march is. Upon them both a bridge of squared stone, and in the year 13 the first downfall this bridge did e'er sustain. By ruin of 3 arches nixed the town, yet were rebuilt, thereafter were thrown down. 5 arches in the year fourscore and 2, therefore I courage take, and hope to see A bridge yet built, although I aged be, More stately firm, more sumptuous and more fair, Than any former age could yet compare. Thus Gaul assured me it would be so, And by good genius truly doth it know, For what we do presage is not in gross, For we be brethren of the rosy cross. Oh, is that supposed to be gross? Grose. We, the brethren of the rosy cross. We have the Mason word and second sight. Things for to come we can foretell aright. And shall we show what mystery we mean in fair acrostics Carolus Rex is seen. Okay. In 1638, when Adamson and other self-styled Brethren of the Rosy Cross did not hesitate to arrogate them to themselves the Mason word and second sight, and there is no record of any Freemasons ever objecting to this claim, it is also worth noting in passing the status accorded by the poem to Charles I. As the 30 Years' War rocked the continent, as Catholic victory threatened continental Protestantism with extinction, Britain generally and the Stuart monarchy in particular loomed increasingly as a bastion, a bulwark, a refuge. Driven from his seat at Heidelberg, Friedrich, Count Palatine of the Rhine, and his wife Elizabeth, daughter of James I, found a haven at The Hague. Here they established a new Rosicrucian court in exile, to which German refugees thronged and from which they were shunted on to England, where the father and then the brother of their Stuart protectress seemingly reigned secure, shielded by the moat of the Channel. Then civil war erupted in England. Parliament aligned itself against the monarchy, a king was executed, and Cromwell's dour protectorate was established. Although not as horrific as the 30 Years' War on the continent, the conflict in England, which can be regarded as a kind of offshoot or tributary of the 30 Years' War, was certainly trauma enough. England may not have been threatened with a reimposed Catholic hegemony, but she was subjected to another form of religious control, perhaps even more fanatical, certainly more intolerant, uncompromising, and austere. In works such as Paradise Lost, Milton could get away with veiled Neoplatonism, although even he can repeatedly foul ran sorry, even he ran repeatedly afoul of the regime. But in the climate of the Protectorate, Freemasonry, with its spectrum of heterodox religious, philosophical, and scientific interests, kept a prudently low profile, and the invisible college remained invisible. Later, Freemasons consistently stress an absence of any political interest or allegiance on the part of their predecessors. Freemasonry is repeatedly said to have been apolitical from its very inception. We would argue that this position is of later development, and that the Freemasonry of the 17th century, and much of the 18th as well, was indeed politically engage. I don't know why they decided they had to use the French word there, but okay. Its roots lay in families and guilds bound in ancient allegiance to the Stuarts and the Stuart monarchy. It had found its way from Scotland down to England under the auspices of James I, a Scottish king who was himself a Freemason. The old Sinclair charters explicitly acknowledged the patronage and protection of the crown, and in a manuscript from the mid-17th century it is demanded of Freemasons, quote, that you be true men to the king without any treason or falsehood, and that you shall know no treason or falsehood, but you shall amend it, or else give notice thereof to the king. In virtue of this injunction, Freemasons were bound in fealty to the monarch. The absence of any vociferous pro-Stuart statements during the first 3/4 of the 17th century can hardly be taken as proof of political apathy, indifference, or neutrality on the part of Freemasonry. Prior to the Civil War, there would have been no need for any such statements. The Stuarts' claim to the English throne appeared secure, and loyalty to the dynasty would have been too self-evident, too taken for granted, to require explicit declaration. During the Protectorate, on the other hand, any formal declaration of Stuart loyalties would have been exceedingly dangerous. Specific individuals might, of course, profess their adherence to the monarchy, provided they did not challenge the authority of the Parliament or of Cromwell's regime. But it is scarcely to be credited that Cromwell would have sanctioned a semi-secret network of lodges to disseminate political views which he found inimical. Yeah. Freemasonry was already under a cloud of suspicion by virtue of the relaxed, tolerant, and eclectic contrast it presented to the government's austere Puritanism. To have declared a Stuart allegiance would have been tantamount to institutional suicide, and individual Freemasons would have incurred the attention of the notorious witch-finder generals. In consequence, Freemasonry, to the extent that it can be traced at all during the Protectorate, is studiously, even strenuously, non-committal. Bear with me 1 second here. I want to write down that term, witch-finder generals. I like it. Gives me ideas. Okay. There we go. Yeah. In short, then, Freemasonry during the Civil War and the Protectorate never repudiated its adherence to the Stuart monarchy. It simply remained prudently silent. Behind this silence, the old allegiances remained firmly intact, and it is hardly coincidental that in 1660, with the Stuart Restoration and Charles II's assumption of the throne, Freemasonry, both in its own right and through the Royal Society, should come into its own. But if Freemasons remained loyal to the Stuart monarchy, they were still capable of protesting, by force of arms if necessary, against Stuart abuses. In 1629, Charles I had dissolved Parliament. In 1638, annoyed by the consequences of the king's aristocratic action, the leading nobles, ministers, and burghers of Scotland drew up what they called the National Covenant. This covenant protested against the monarch's arbitrary rule and reaffirmed Parliament's legislative prerogatives. The signatories pledged themselves to mutual defense and began to raise an army. Of particular prominence among the so-called Covenanters was the Earl of Rothes. In an entry in his diary dated 13 October 1637, there is the first known reference to the Mason word. Quote unquote, the Mason word. In August 1639, a Covenanter controlled Parliament convened in Edinburgh. Provoked by this act of defiance, Charles mobilized his army and prepared to advance against Scotland. Before he could do so, however, the Scottish army under the Earl of Montrose moved south, defeated an English contingent, and in August 1640 occupied Newcastle. A truce was concluded, but the Scots remained in Newcastle until June 1641, when peace was officially signed. Against the background of the events of 1641, while the Covenanters' army occupied Newcastle, there occurred what Freemasons themselves regarded as a landmark in their history, the first recorded initiation on English soil. On 20 May 1641, Sir Robert Moray, Mr. the Right Honourable Mr. Robert Moray, General Quarter Mr. to the Army of Scotland, was inducted at or near Newcastle into the Old Mary's Chapel Lodge of Edinburgh. For Moray to have been inducted into the lodge implies, of course, that the lodge, and indeed some species of lodge system, was already in existence and fully operational. As we have seen, this had in fact been the case for some time. General Alexander Hamilton, who was present at Moray's induction, had himself been inducted the year before. Nevertheless, Moray is often regarded by later commentators as the first full-fledged Freemason. But if he was not quite that, he was certainly important enough to warrant the attention of scholars and to bring Freemasonry out of the shadows and into an increasingly intense limelight. Although the precise date is not known, Moray was born at the beginning of the 17th century into a well-established Perthshire family and died in 1673. As a young man, he saw military service in France with a Scottish unit, believed to have been the by then resuscitated Scots Guard, and rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel. In 1643, a year and a half after his Masonic initiation, he was knighted by Charles I, then returned to France and resumed his military career, becoming a full colonel in 1645. In the same year, he became a secret envoy authorized to negotiate a treaty between France and Scotland whereby Charles, deposed in 1642, would have been restored to the throne. In 1646, he was involved in another plot to secure the king's escape from parliamentary custody. Around 1647, he married Sophia, daughter of David Lindsay, Lord Balcarres. Like the Sinclairs, Settons, and Montgomerys, with whom they were associated, the Lindsays had long been among the noble Scottish families steeped in esoteric tradition. Lord Balcarres himself was known as an hermeticist and practicing alchemist. His wife was the daughter of Alexander Seton, of the Seton-Montgomery branch of the family, which was to play a key role in later Freemasonry. It was into this circle that Moray, by virtue of his marriage, entered, though it is worth noting that his induction into Freemasonry predated his marriage by some 6 years. On the execution of Charles I, Moray On the execution of Charles I, Moray resumed his military and diplomatic career in France. He was a close confidant of the future Charles II, and held a number of official posts under the exiled monarch in waiting. In 1654, he and his brother-in-law, Alexander Lindsay, who had succeeded to the Balcarres title, were with Charles in Paris. Then between 1657 and 1660, he was in exile at Maastricht, devoting his time primarily, as he wrote, to chemical pursuits. Shortly after the Restoration, Moray's brother, Sir William Moray of Dreghorn, became Master of Works, that is, Master of the Operative Masons, to the newly reinstated king, Murray himself returned to London and held a number of judicial appointments, even though he never actually sat on the bench. In 1661, he became Lord of Exchequer for Scotland, and in 1663, the country's deputy secretary. For the next 7 years, he, the king, and the Duke of Lauderdale were effectively to govern Scotland on their own, although Murray maintained close relations with the Scottish branch of the Hamilton family as well. He remained until his death one of the king's closest advisers. Charles had great confidence in him, and his counsels were uniformly for prudence and moderation. The king often visited him privately at his laboratory in Whitehall and described him as head of his own church. Among his associates at this time, all of whom spoke of him in glowing terms, were Evelyn, Hughes, and Pepys. According to the DNB, the disinterestedness and elevation of his aims were universally admitted. He was devoid of ambition, indeed, as he said, he had no stomach for public employments. I don't know what DNB is. It's an abbreviation for something. If somebody knows, let me know. According to another of Murray's contemporaries, he was a renowned chemist, a great patron of the Rosicrucians, and an excellent mathematician. It was in this capacity that he was to make his most enduring claim on posterity. For Murray was not only one of the founders of the Royal Society, he was also its guiding spirit, and so Huygens says its soul. In Francis Yates' words, quote, Murray did more than probably any other individual to foster the foundation of the Royal Society and to persuade Charles II to establish it by patronage, end quote. For the duration of his life, Murray was to regard the Royal Society as perhaps his greatest achievement and was, quote unquote, watched assiduously over its interests. Given the fact that so few records of 17th century Freemasonry survive, one can only deduce its interests, activities, and orientation by the prominent individuals associated with it. Murray provides just such a gauge. He would appear to be typical and representative of 17th century Freemasonry. If he is indeed so, the Freemasonry of the time can be characterized as a fusion of traditions filtered down through the Scots Guard and through noble Scottish families like the Lindsays and Settons, of chemistry or alchemy and Rosicrucianism filtering across from the continent, and of the spectrum of scientific and philosophical interest which prevailed in the Invisible College and subsequently the Royal Society. It might, of course, be argued that Murray was an exception, a highly eclectic and idiosyncratic individual, not, in fact, a typical representative of Freemasonry at all. But the annals of Freemasonry for the time cite one more truly prominent figure, and he displays precisely the same spectrum of interests, influences, and preoccupations as Murray. This figure, known today perhaps primarily for the museum which bears his name, was Elias Ashmole. Ashmole was born in Lichfield in 1617 during the Civil War. He was active on the Royalist side, then in 1644 retired to his native town, where he deposed Charles I and appointed him Commissioner of Excise. His official duties brought him frequently to Oxford. Here he came under the influence of Captain, later Sir, George Wharton, who instilled in him a lifelong fervor for alchemy and astrology. By 1646, Ashmole was moving in London's astrological circles, but he maintained close contacts with the Invisible College, which began in 1648 to meet in Oxford. It included at that time Robert Boyle, Christopher Wren, and Dr. John Wilkins, another founder member of the Royal Society. Ashmole had in his possession at least 5 original manuscripts of John Dee, and in 1650 edited one of them, a treatise on alchemy, for publication under the anagrammatic pseudonym of James Hassol. Other hermetic and alchemical works, wow. Other hermetic and alchemical works followed, which influenced both Boyle and later Newton, while Ashmole himself became a well-known frequenter of Rosicrucian circles. In 1656, an English translation of an important German Rosicrucian text was published with a dedication, quote, to the only philosopher in the present age, Elias Ashmole, end quote. Charles II was deeply interested in alchemy, and Ashmole's work on the subject had impressed him. In the new king's first appointment as restored monarch, Ashmole was instilled in the post of Windsor Herald. His favor with the court steadily increased, and numerous other offices were conferred upon him. So, too, before long were international accolades. Since 1655 he had been engaged on his magnum opus, A History of the Order of the Garter, and in passing of every other chivalric institution in the West. This work, still regarded as the definitive text in its field, was published in 1672, receiving immense acclaim not only in England but abroad as well. In 1677 Ashmole bestowed on the University of Oxford the antiquarian museum he had inherited from a friend, together with his own additions to it. Oxford in exchange was obliged to house the collection, which according to a contemporary source consisted of 12 wagon loads. Extravagantly praised and eulogized, hailed as one of the sages of his epoch, Ashmole died in 1692. Ashmole had been initiated as a Freemason in 1646, 5 years after Moray. The event is noted in his own diary. Quote, 1646, October 16, 4h30 p.m. I was made, 4:30 p.m. I was made a Freemason at Warrington in Lancashire with Cole, Henry Mainwaring of not sure, in Cheshire. The name of those who were then of the lodge, Mr. Rich Penkett, Warden, Mr. James Collier, Mr. Rich Sankey, Henry Littler, John Ellum, Rich Ellum, and Hugh Brewer. 36 years later, in 1682, Ashmole's diary records another lodge meeting, this time in London, at the Masons' Hall, and the list of those in attendance includes a number of prominent gentlemen in the city. Ashmole's diary thus bears witness to a number of things: to his own continued allegiance to the Freemasonry over 36 years, to the spread of Freemasonry across England, and to the caliber of the people associated with it by the 1680s. Francis Yates notes it as a point of significance that the two persons of whom we have the earliest certain membership of Masonic lodges were both foundation members of the Royal Society. Together with Moray, Ashmole was indeed one of the Royal Society's founders. All around the Civil War and Cromwell's protectorate, he was, like Moray, a fervent royalist, passionately dedicated to the restoration of the Stuart monarchy. And much more flagrantly than Moray, Ashmole displayed a preoccupation with chivalry and chivalric orders. In his History of the Garter, he addressed himself to the Templars, and became the first writer on record since the suppression of the order to speak favorably of them. It is through Ashmole, noted antiquarian, expert on chivalric history, prominent Freemason, co-founder of the Royal Society, that one can discern what must have been a prevailing attitude toward the Templars in 17th century Freemasonic and Rosicrucian thought. French National Patent Certificate. Oh, okay, you looked it up. Diplôme national du brevet, probably. So that's sorry, I just noticed you put that up there. That's the DNB. Um, so it said it's talking about Murray at that point. Among his associates at this time, all of whom spoke of him in glowing terms, were Evelyn, Huygens, and Pays. According to the DNB, the disinterestedness and elevation of his aims were universally admitted. He was devoid of ambition. Indeed, as he said, he had no stomach for public employments. So, yeah, French national patent certificate. Yeah. Yeah, it's a little beyond me. I'm not sure. Okay. Looking something up. Trying to find where I was anyway. Do nothing, bitch. What? um, I'm trying to find my place here. I'm just going to start the paragraph over. Francis Yates notes it as a point of significance that the two persons of whom he had the earliest certain membership of Masonic lodges were both foundation members of the Royal Society. Together with Murray, Ashmole was indeed one of the Royal Society's founders. All through the Civil War and the Cromwell's protectorate, he was, like Murray, a fervent royalist passionately dedicated to the restoration of the Stuart monarchy, and much more flagrantly than Murray, Ashmole displayed a preoccupation with chivalry and chivalric orders. In his History of the Garter, he addressed himself to the Templars and became the first writer on record since the suppression of the order to speak favorably of them. It was as though it is through Ashmole, noted antiquarian, expert on chivalric history, prominent Freemason, co-founder of the Royal Society, that one can discern what must have been a prevailing attitude toward the Templars in 17th century Freemasonic and Rosicrucian thought. Indeed, it is with Ashmole that the rehabilitation of the Templars, at least so far as the general public is concerned, effectively begins. But Ashmole was not alone. Diplomat of national. Yeah, it still doesn't. I still don't know the context. It doesn't. Maybe if I was more well read on the French history, I would understand what that means. But it's, eh. Okay. In 1533, the German magus, philosopher, and alchemist Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettensheim first published his famous opus of occult philosophy. That's the title of occult philosophy. This work is one of the landmarks of esoteric literature, and it consolidated Agrippa's reputation as the supreme magician of his age. The real prototype, more than any historical George or Johann Faustus, for the figure in Marlowe's play and Goethe's um, dramatic poem. In the original Latin edition of his work, Agrippa mentions the Templars in passing. His comments His comments reflect what, in the absence of any contrary evidence or tradition in Germany at the time, was the prevailing view of the detestable heresy of the Templars. In 1651, the first English translation of Agrippa's work was published. It contained a short dedicatory poem of praise by the alchemist and natural philosopher Thomas Vaughan, a friend and disciple, as we shall see, of Moray, and was sold in a bookshop in the churchyard of St. Paul's. Agrippa's reference to the Templars had in the original Latin consisted of a few words in a text of more than 500 pages, and yet the anonymous English translator was sufficiently offended or embarrassed by this reference to change it. The English edition therefore refers to the detestable heresy, not of the Templars, but of old churchmen. It is thus clear that by 1651, 2 years after the death of Charles I, the rehabilitation of the Templars was already underway. There were certain interests in England, reflected by the translator of Agrippa's work, and presumably by his anticipated leadership, who were not prepared to see the Templars vilified, not even in passing, not even by so august a figure as the Archmagus of Nettesheim. The restoration of the Stuarts of Freemasonry and Freemasonry. If Moray was the guiding spirit of the soul and the soul of the Royal Society, Dr. John Wilkins was its driving force and organizational mastermind. Wilkins was closely associated with the Rosicrucian court of Friedrich, Count Palatine of the Rhine, and Elizabeth Stuart. Subsequently, he served as chaplain to their son, who was sent to England for schooling. Eventually, Wilkins became Bishop of Chester. In 1648, he published his first important work, Mathematical Magic, which drew heavily on the work of Robert Fludd and John Dee, and extolled both in its preface. In the same year, Wilkins began to convene the meetings at Oxford, to which the Royal Society itself officially traces its origins. It was at Oxford, as we have seen, that Ashmole made the acquaintance of the group. The meetings at Oxford continued for 11 years, until 1659, after which they were moved to London. On the restoration of in 1660, Moray approached the reinstated monarch for royal sponsorship. The Royal Society was duly established in 1661, with the king as its official patron and also a fellow. Moray was the organization's first president. Among the other founding members were Ashmole, Wilkins, Boyle, Wren, and the diarist John Evelyn, and two especially important Rosicrucian refugees from Germany, Samuel Hartlib and Theodore Hack. In 1672, Isaac Newton became a fellow. In 1703, he was elected president and remained so until his death in 1727. During and immediately following Newton's presidency, the overlap between the Royal Society and Freemasonry was to be particularly marked. The Royal Society at this time included the famous Chevalier Ramsay, who will soon figure prominently in our story. It included James Hamilton, Lord Paisley, and 7th Earl of Abercorn, joint author of the acclaimed Treatise on Harmony, and a Grand Master of English Freemasonry. Most importantly of all, perhaps, it included John de Salguier, I've never heard that name, a close friend of Newton's, who became a fellow in 1714 and then curator. In 1719, de Salguier became the third Grand Master of England's Grand Lodge, and he was to remain one of the most eminent figures in English Freemasonry for the next 20 years. In 1731, he was to initiate Francois, Duc de Lorraine, subsequently husband of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. In 1737, he was to initiate Frederick, Prince of Wales, to whom he was chaplain. But the Royal Society in the years immediately following the Restoration was only one conduit for Freemasonry and Freemasonic thought. The spectrum of activities embraced by 17th century Freemasonry included science, philosophy, mathematics, and geometry, Hermetic, Neoplatonic, and Rosicrucian thought. The same preoccupations are conspicuous in the work of some of the most consequential literary figures of the period, the twin brothers Thomas and Henry Vaughan, for example, and the so-called Cambridge Platonists Henry More and Ralph Cudworth. No records survive to confirm that these individuals were actually initiated members of the specific lodges. At the same time, they could not reflect more accurately and precisely the thrust and orientation of Freemasonry's concerns. Henry More's circle included the distinguished physician, scientist, and alchemist Francis von Helmont. Thomas Vaughan, noted as an alchemist and natural philosopher, became a close personal friend, disciple, and protege of Sir Robert Moray. Earlier, during the Civil War, Vaughan and his brother had been active on the royalist side under Cromwell's protectorate. On the royalist side, period. Under Cromwell's protectorate, Thomas Vaughan had translated, using the pseudonym of Eugenius Philalethes, a number of esoteric and hermetic works from the continent, including the famous Rosicrucian manifestos. Vaughan's close connections with Moray suggest that even if he wasn't a Freemason himself, he was close to the mainstream of Freemasonic thought, and his interests were echoed by his brother Henry, who, so far as posterity is concerned, has proved the more eloquent spokesman. Henry Vaughan's poetry, which ranks with that of Andrew Marvell and George Herbert, can be regarded as a summation of the currents and influences which characterize 17th century Freemasonry. But while Moore and the Vaughan brothers created lasting testaments in literature, perhaps the most impressive monument to the 17th century Freemasonry endures today in London's architecture. In 1666, the Great Fire leveled 80% of the old city, including 87 churches, and necessitated a virtually complete reconstruction of the capital. This entailed a prodigious and concentrated effort on the part of the operative guilds of stonemasons. Operative masonry was thus catapulted to public consciousness, with its handiwork and skills prominently and majestically on display in such structures as St. Paul's, St. James, Piccadilly, and the Royal Exchange. As the new city took shape before the eyes of the populace, a hitherto unprecedented prestige accrued to its architects and builders, and much of this rubbed off onto adherents of speculative Freemasonry, who were quick to stress their kinship with their operative brethren. The most important figure in this context was, of course, Sir Christopher Wren. Wren, as we have seen, was an habitue of the Invisible College that met at Oxford and subsequently became a founding member of the Royal Society. He is alleged to have become Grand Master of Freemasonry in England in 1685. At the same time, he was not just a thinker but also a practicing architect. He thus constituted a crucial, perhaps the crucial, link between speculative Freemasonry and the operative guilds. In philosophy and religion, then, in the arts, in the sciences, most manifestly in architecture, Freemasonry in the period immediately following the Restoration entered upon halcyon days. But if it prospered during this time, it also exerted a beneficial and constructive influence. Indeed, one could argue that, with its increasing dissemination and its progressively more public nature, it did much to heal the wounds of the Civil War. This is not to say, of course, that it lacked detractors. In 1676, for example, Poor Robin's Intelligence, a short-lived satirical broadsheet, printed the following mock advertisement. Quote, "These are to give notice that the modern green-ribboned cabal, together with the ancient brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, the Hermetic Adepti, and the company of accepted Masons, intend all to dine together on the 31st November next at the Flying Bull in Windmill Crown Street." End quote. But such light-hearted lampoons could scarcely do Freemasonry any harm. If anything, they functioned like modern gossip columns, stimulating public interest and probably enhancing the very prestige they purported to tarnish. This applied equally to the work of Dr. Robert Plot, custodian of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, who in 1686 published his Natural History of Staffordshire. Plot sought to mock, if not actually condemn, Freemasonry. Instead, he furnished Freemasonry with precisely the kind of advertisement that most conduced to its appeal, and at the same time provided posterity not just with a valuable source book, but also with a testimony to how influential the institution had become. And there's a long quote here. "To these add the customs relating to the county, whereof they have one of admitting men into the society of Freemasons, that in the moorlands of the county seems to be of greatest request than anywhere else, though I find the custom spread more or less all over the nation, for here I find persons of the most eminent quality, that did not disdain to be of this fellowship, nor indeed need they, were it of that antiquity and honor that is pretended in a large parchment volume they have amongst them, containing the history and rules of the craft of masonry, which is there deduced not only from sacred writ but profane story, particularly that it was brought into England by Saint Amphibal, and first communicated to Saint Alban, who set down the charges of masonry, and was made paymaster and governor of the king's works, and gave them charges and manners as Saint Amphibal had taught them, which were after confirmed by King Athelstan, whose youngest son Edwin loved well masonry, took upon himself the charges, and learned the manners, and obtained for them of his father a free charter. Whereupon he caused them to assemble at York, and to bring all the old books of their craft, and out of them ordained such charges and manners as they then thought fit, which charges in the said scroll or parchment volume are in part declared, and thus was the craft of masonry grounded and confirmed in England, and it also there declared that these charges and manners were after perused and approved by King Henry VI and his council, both as to masters and fellows of this right worshipful craft." End quote. That was a long one. All right. Dr. Plot goes on at considerable length to describe what he knows of Freemasonic rituals, lodge meetings, and initiation procedures, as well as the integrity with which operative stonemasons conduct their building. At the very end of his account, in one fragment of an immensely convoluted sentence, he launches his attack. Quote, "But some other practices they have, to which they are sworn after their fashion, that none know but themselves, which I have reason to suspect are much worse than these, perhaps as bad as the history of the craft itself, than which there is nothing I ever met with more false or incoherent." End quote. And that was the attack in a convoluted sentence. Yeah. The way they wrote back then, that first quote was like 3 sentences, maybe 2. And then that one was part of a sentence. All right. Almost at the end of this first chapter, then I'll take a quick break and then do chapter 11. It is a lame fashion in which to conduct an attack. Most of Plot's readers, not surprisingly, ignored or never reached his concluding sally and warmed instead to everything that preceded it. The ancient and illustrious pedigree claimed by Freemasonry, the involvement of persons of the most eminent quality, the benefits of membership, the mutual support, the good works, the prestige attached to building and architecture. After all this, the castigation at the end must have seemed a mere spasm of petulance and possibly of pique at not being accepted as a Freemason himself. As we have seen, then, Freemasonry in the period between 1660 and 1688 basked in a kind of golden age. It had already established itself, perhaps even more effectively than the Anglican Church, as a great unifying force in English society. It had already begun to provide a democratic forum where king and commoner, aristocrats and artisans, intellectuals and craftsmen, could come together and, within the sanctum of the lodge, address themselves to the matters of mutual concern. But this situation was not to last. Within a quarter of a century, Freemasonry was to suffer the same traumatic divisions as English society itself. Okay, that is the end of that chapter. And the next one is right at 8 pages. So I'm going to go ahead and do it, but I am going to take a break first, drink some water, let my voice chill for a minute, and I will be back in a few minutes. All right, let's get back to it here, shall we? We've got 8 pages to go to cover our second chapter for the night. So, Chapter 11, Viscount Dundee. Around 1661, Charles II's younger brother, James, Duke of York, converted to Catholicism. He did so quietly without any fanfare, and there were, in consequence, no more vigorous objections. No very vigorous objections. But in 1685, Charles II died, and his brother ascended the throne as James II. Immediately, the new monarch began proselytizing on behalf of his religion. Favors were conferred on the Jesuits. Payments were offered to individuals in high places if they converted. The civil, judicial, and military establishments were filled with Catholic appointees. As head of the Church of England, moreover, James was able to appoint pro-Catholic bishops, or if he so desired, leave sees vacant. I don't know what that means. It's sees, like sees. Leave sees vacant. I don't know what the... Okay. Prior to 1688, James had sired 2 daughters, Mary and Anne, both of whom had been raised as Protestants. It was generally assumed that one or the other of them would become his heir, and that England would again have a Protestant sovereign. On the basis of this assumption, James's Catholicism was tolerated as a transient phase, distasteful, but preferable to the kind of traumatic civic upheaval that had occurred 40 years before. In 1688, however, James fathered a son who, by right of succession, would take precedence over his female heirs, and England was thus confronted with the prospect of a Catholic dynasty. 3 years before, moreover, in France, Louis XIV had revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had guaranteed freedom of religion to Protestants. French Protestants were suddenly, after being left in peace for nearly a century, subjected to renewed persecution and deportation. Fearing the possibility of a similar fate, English Protestants were provoked to resistance. Friction between Parliament and the king increased. Then James demanded that the Anglican clergy read a declaration of tolerance for Catholics and other dissenters, and 7 bishops refused to comply. They were indicted for their disobedience by royal decree, but in a patent snub of the king's authority, they were acquitted. On the same day, Parliament offered the throne to James's fervently anti-Catholic daughter, Mary, and her husband, William, Prince of Orange. The Dutch prince accepted the invitation. On 5th November 1688, he landed at Torbay to become the new king of England. Fears of another full-fledged civil war on English soil proved mercifully unfounded. James chose not to fight, and on 23 December decamped, going into exile in France. In March of 1689, however, he landed in Ireland with French troops and military advisers. Here he summoned his own parliament and proceeded to raise an army from his Irish Catholic subjects under the command of Richard Talbot, Earl of Tyrconnell. Sporadic fighting ensued. Londonderry was besieged by James's Catholic troops on 19 April and held out until 30 July, when it was relieved. But it was not until a year later that the armies of William and James met in pitched battle. At the River Boyne on 1 July 1690, James was disastrously defeated and went into permanent exile in France. His supporters continued the conflict for another year until 12 July 1691, when they were again defeated at the Battle of Aghrim. The shattered Catholic forces fell back on Limerick, were besieged there, and at last on 3 October capitulated. Thus ended English's England's glorious revolution, and with it the rule of the Stuart dynasty. Throughout the events that cost him his throne, James, according to one historian, quote, had displayed political ineptitude of almost heroic proportions. End quote. That's a good quote too. Ineptitude of heroic proportions. I like it. Insofar as it was a revolution at all, that of 1688 had been reasonably civilized. Strictly speaking, it was less a revolution than a coup d'etat, and a bloodless one at that, so far at least as England proper was concerned. Nevertheless, it rent British society as dramatically as the Civil War had done earlier in the century. For the second time in less than 50 years, a Stuart monarch had been deposed, and this occasioned much soul-searching, both individual and collective. Whatever the transgressions of one particular king, there were many in England who felt the Stuart monarchy possessed a legitimacy, a native pedigree, and intrinsic Britishness, which the Dutch House of Orange, British's arch enemy only a quarter of a century before, did not. In Scotland, loyalty to the ancient ruling house took precedence ultimately over all religious affiliations. In Ireland, of course, James's embrace of Catholicism had especially endeared him to the populace. The fissures created in English society were mirrored by those which opened up among the noble Scottish families to so entwined in our story. At the siege of Londonderry, for example, there were Hamiltons on both sides. Lord James Sinclair remained loyal to the crown, whoever happened to be wearing it, while his brother was in prison and his son, an officer in the Scots Guard, died at the Battle of Boyne. In Scotland, the Stuart cause was to be championed primarily by John Graham of Claverhouse, created first Viscount Dundee by James II in 1688. Like many of the other noble Scottish houses, the Grahams of Claverhouse could claim blood kinship with the Stuarts and thereby descent from Bruce. In 1413, Sir William Graham had married James I of Scotland's sister, the great-granddaughter of Marjorie Bruce and Walter the Stuart. Excuse me. Later, a member of the family had married the sister of Cardinal Beaton, the arch-conspirator on behalf of Guise and Lorraine interests. For the most part, however, the family's history was undistinguished. A record of non-entities dowered with a competence. John Graham of Claverhouse, Viscount Dundee, was born in 1648. He was a well-educated man, having graduated with an M.A. from the University of St. Andrews in 1661. Subsequently, he was to serve both Charles II and James II. Between 1672 and 1674, he was a volunteer in France with the Duke of Monmouth and with John Churchill, later Duke of Marlborough. In 1683, he was at court in England with Charles, and 2 years later with James. In 1684, the latter conferred on him the estate of Dudhope Castle, and he married Lady Jean Cochrane, daughter of Lord William Cochrane, a prominent Freemason. In 1686, he was promoted Major General of Horse. Among his closest friends was Colin Lindsay, 3rd Earl of Balcarres, grandson of the alchemist. In April 1689, just as Catholic armies in Ireland were laying siege to Londonderry, Claverhouse, having mustered pro-Stuart forces in Scotland, raised the standard of King James in Dundee. On 27 July, his troops met those of the Williamite commander Major General Hugh Mackay at the pass of Killiecrankie, about 30 miles from Perth. There was much preliminary maneuvering, but the battle, when it finally commenced, lasted approximately 3 minutes. Mackey's soldiers managed to discharge one volley before they were overwhelmed by Claverhouse's charge. At the very moment that the Williamite line disintegrated, Claverhouse, galloping at the head of his victorious men, fell from his horse, shot fatally through the left eye. A curious echo of the lance thrust from which Gabriel de Montgomery had killed Henry II of France a century and a quarter before. Ah! With Claverhouse gone, the Stuart cause in Scotland faltered from lack of leadership. The army straggled on, advancing to Dunkeld, where they were defeated. In May of the following year, a second defeat at Cromdale put an end to organized resistance in Scotland, at least for a generation. There is, according to one historian, a persistent tradition that at Killiecrankie Dundee was the victim of foul play. There is indeed evidence to suggest that Claverhouse did not die in battle, that he was deliberately murdered, amidst the confusion of the charge, by two men acting for King William, who had joined his army and infiltrated his staff. That in itself would not be particularly extraordinary. On the contrary, it would have been pretty much in keeping with the conventions of the time to assassinate a dangerous enemy. That is relevant to our inquiry, or what is relevant to our inquiry, is not whether Claverhouse died in combat or by an assassin's hand, but the fact that the body, when found on the field, reputedly bore a Templar cross. Master of the Scottish Templars? According to the esoteric historian A.E. Waite, that's Arthur Edward Waite, who I have almost everything he's ever written. We'll get into some of those, along with Agrippa that they mentioned earlier. Quote, it has been said that Dom Calmet has lent the authority of his name to three important statements. One, that John Claverhouse, Viscount Dundee, was Grand Master of the Order of Templars in Scotland. 2. That when he fell at Killiecrankie on July 27, 1689, he wore the Grand Cross of the Order. 3. That this cross was given to Calmet by his brother. If this story be true, we are brought at once into the presence of a Templar survival or restoration that owes nothing to the dreams or realities of Chevalier Ramsay, and nothing to Masonry itself. We know that evidence is wanting at every point for the alleged perpetuation of the old Templar order in connection with Masonry, and that the legends of such perpetuation bear all the traces of manufacture. But if a Grand Cross of the Temple was actually and provably found on the body of Viscount Dundee, it is certain that the Order of the Temple had survived or revived in 1689. End quote. Waite wrote these words in 1921, before much of the evidence we have outlined here became available. Waite, for example, was unaware of the Scots Guard as a possible repository for Templar traditions. He was also unaware of the intricate network of family connections whereby such traditions may have been preserved. Nevertheless, the tenor of his statement remains valid. If Claverhouse were wearing a bona fide Templar cross, which was indeed pre-1307, it would constitute impressive proof that the order was still operating, or had been resurrected in Scotland in 1689. Unfortunately, Waite gives no source whatever for the story he quotes. For that, one must look elsewhere. In 1920, a year before Waite's account, the following reference appeared in the Journal of Quatuor Coronati, a premier Freemasonic research lodge in the United Kingdom. Quote, in 1689, at the Battle of Killiecrankie, Lord Dundee lost his life as a leader of the Scottish Stuart party. According to the testimony of the Abbé Calmet, he is said to have been Grand Master of the Order of the Temple in Scotland. End quote. This statement can be found earlier when a researcher into Freemasonry, John Yarker, writes it in 1872. Quote, and that Lord Mar was Grand Master of the Scottish Templars in 1715, in succession to Viscount Dundee, who was slain at Killiecrankie in 1689, bearing the cross of the order, as we are informed by Dom Calmet. End quote. Prior to Yarker, the story appeared in a booklet published in 1843. The author is anonymous, but may have been the Scottish poet and academic W.E. Atone. Quote, we find from the testimony of the Abbé Calmet that he had received from David Graham, titular Viscount of Dundee, the Grand Cross of the Order, worn by his gallant and ill-fated brother at the Battle of Killiecrankie. Il était, says the Abbé, Grand Maître de l'Ordre des Templiers en Écosse. En Écosse. There's no R in there. End quote. We are left with three crucial questions. Who was Lord Mar, Claverhouse's successor, according to Yarker, as Grand Master of the Scottish Templars? Who was the Abbé Calmet, apparently the all-important source of the story? Who was Claverhouse's elusive brother David, who allegedly passed the cross from the dead Viscount to the French abbey? John Erskine, Earl of Mar, was a well-known Jacobite leader. He became Earl in 1689, the year of Killiecrankie. Initially, he opposed the Stuart cause and as late as 1705 was acting for the Crown as Secretary of State for Scotland. During the next 10 years, he changed allegiances so frequently that he earned the nickname of Bobbing John. By 1715, however, he had finally committed himself to the exiled Stuarts, and in that year took a prominent part in the rebellion on their behalf. With the suppression of the revolt, he lost his estates and went into exile with James II in Rome. In 1721, he was appointed Jacobite minister to the French court. That is, the Stuarts' ambassador to France. In Paris, he became a close friend of Chevalier Ramsay, one of the chief propagators, as we shall see, of 18th century Freemasonry. Dom Augustin Calmet was one of the most renowned and respected scholars and historians of his age, known particularly for his versatility in languages. Born in 1672, he became a Benedictine monk in 1688, age 16. In 1704, he held an important post at the Abbey of Munster on the French side of the Rhine. In 1718, he became abbot of St. Leopold in Nancy. In 1728, abbot of Senones, where he died in 1757. His works were voluminous. They included commentaries on all the books of both the Old and New Testaments, a massive history of the Bible as a whole, a history of the Church in Lorraine, an introduction to the prestigious Histoire ecclésiastique of Cardinal Fleury, and in a doughty digression from such lofty labors, a standard text on vampires. From Calmet's published letters, it is clear that between May 1706 and July 1715, he was living in Paris and moving largely in the circles of Jacobite exiles. David Graham, Claverhouse's younger brother, is decidedly more difficult to trace. He is known to have fought at Killiecrankie and to have survived the battle, only to be taken prisoner 3 months later. In 1690, however, he somehow managed to escape his captors and next appears in France, where James II conferred on him the Dundee title formerly held by his brother. As Viscount Dundee, he is cited in a regimental list of the Scots Brigade serving at Dunkerque in June 1692 under Major Generals Buchan and Cannon. Among the other officers on this list there appears Sir Alexander Mullane, father of Sir Hector Maclean, John Fleming, 6th Earl of Wigton, James Galloway, 3rd Baron Dunkeld, and James Seton, 4th Earl of Dunfermline. The last of these have been particularly close to Claverhouse, had commanded his cavalry at Killiecrankie, and was one of the funeral party which secretly removed from the field and possibly interred the dead commander's body. David Graham appears in another French army list of 1693. The last known reference to him anywhere is in an anti-Jacobite pamphlet published in London in 1696. According to this pamphlet, he and other prominent exiles have been given important posts in the French army. After that, David Graham simply vanishes from history. There is a little bit of a quote here. This is curious, one historian observes, since as 3rd Viscount he would have been an important person, end quote. When we contacted the French Army's Historical Service, we received a reply from General Robert Bassac, who reported that he had found no reference to any David Graham. He did, however, find a certain Viscount Graham of Dundee as an officer in the Regiment de Olivie, i.e. Ogilvy, Earl of Airlie, in 1747. This regiment had been raised by David, Comte de Airlie, and formed out of the remnants of the corps defeated at Culloden. Perhaps he was a son of or a nephew. Sorry, that was a quote, and I forgot to say that. The Scots Brigade stationed at Dunkerque in 1692 may perhaps provide an additional clue to David Graham's fate. In May of that year, quote, the Scotch officers, considering that by the loss of the French fleet, King James's restoration would be retarded for some time, and that they were burdensome to the King of France, being in garrisons on whole pay without doing duty, humbly entreated King James to have them reduced into a company of private sentinels, and chose officers amongst themselves to command them. End quote. The unit was reconstituted accordingly. Its list of officers included 2 Ramsays, 2 Sinclairs, 2 Montgomerys, and a Hamilton. It was initially transferred to the south of France, then, in 1693, to Alsace, not far from the Abbey of Munster. In 1697, it was again fighting in the vicinity of this abbey, where by 1704, Dom Calmet had been appointed to the post of Superior. There were thus 2 contexts in which Calmet could conceivably have come into contact with Graham. The first was in Alsace between 1693 and 1706. The second was in Paris after May of 1706, when Calmet was frequenting Jacobite circles there. On the basis of this background information, it is worth looking at the story again. The thrust of it is as follows. 1. John Claverhouse, Viscount Dundee, was Grand Master of some sort of Templar or Neo-Templar organization in Scotland, which had survived in some coherent form at least as late as 1689. 2. Following Claverhouse's death at Killiecrankie, he was succeeded in the Grand Mastership by the Earl of Mar. 3. When Claverhouse's body was recovered from the field of Killiecrankie, he was found to be wearing or carrying some species of original, that is, pre-1307, Templar regalia referred to as the Grand Cross of the Order. And 4. This device, having passed into the hands of his brother David, was then confided to the Abbey Calmet. If the story thus outlined is true, it constitutes the most important evidence of a Templar survival in Scotland since the late 16th century, when the elusive David Seton allegedly rallied the order around him after its lands had been illicitly disposed of by Sir James Sandilands. The story does, however, pose certain questions. If the Scottish Templars were indeed affiliated with the Stuart cause, why was Claverhouse succeeded as Grand Master by the Earl of Mar, who seems at the time to have supported the English Parliament and not to have become a firm Jacobite until 1715? And why, if the Templar regalia was indeed important, was it not passed to the next Grand Master, whoever he was, rather than to a French priest, scholar, and historian? To answer these questions, one must resort to hypotheses and speculation. Yet if the story of Claverhouse's Templar cross were entirely fabricated, it would not, in all probability, contain the contradictions it does. Imagination and invention are free to untrammel themselves from such contradictions in a way that history is not. In any case, and whatever the questions posed by the story, it is certainly plausible. Dom Calmet would have had nothing to gain from making it up, except perhaps as a tale on which to dine out. And if that were the case, he would have made more of it than he did. Calmet, moreover, is generally accepted as an impeccably reliable witness. If Claverhouse did indeed have a cross or some other regalia of Templar origin, it would most likely have passed into his brother's hands, and his brother, as we have seen, had sufficient opportunity to confide it to the French priest. For a piece of original Templar regalia to have survived would have been unusual. We ourselves have personally seen and handled other such effects, which have been carefully and lovingly preserved in Scotland. We have seen and handled an original rule of the order dating from before 1156. The sheer existence of these items bears eloquent witness to how much has eluded the researches of historians. But there is one other crucial fragment of evidence to support the story of Claverhouse's Templar cross, and as we have seen, the Templar patrimony in Scotland survived intact within the order of St. John until 1564, when Sir James Sandilands, its appointed administrator, contrived to turn it into his own secular property. In the 15th century, Claverhouse's ancestor, Robert Graham, had married the daughter of the Constable of Dundee. By this marriage he became brother-in-law to John Sandilands, Sir James's grandfather. The Graham and Sandilands family were thus linked, and an item held in trust by the latter could easily have found its way into the former's hands. And that is the end of chapter 11. So we will pick up chapter 12, the development of the Grand Lodge, next time. And it looks like that's another 11 page. So I might, yeah, there's two fairly short, there's 21 pages again for two more chapters. So I think I'll do two more chapters next time. Because I'm kind of anxious. I'm enjoying this book, but I know it's dry for people that are listening. So I'm kind of anxious to get through it, even though I'm enjoying it very much. So if I can do two chapters per reading, that'll speed it along. We can get on to the next book, which I've already decided on. It's going to be 1984. I'm not going to do a poll. I'm just going to do it. So, all right. We will pick that up on Tuesday for the next two chapters. Let's see. Is anybody around? Actually, no. I take that back. I'm not going to raid anybody because I'm going to end this, take a quick break, and then play some Hogwarts Legacy. So I will see you all in a little bit.